Okay, so this video is going to be on perceiving objects, our ability to use that visual stuff. Usually we're talking now about the ventral stream, information going to the temporal lobe, but to be able to perceive different things in our environment around us. So yeah, I know what that is. We're just going to talk a little more about that and really about the fundamental challenge the brain has when trying to do that object perception task. So first, let's start out with a fun little quiz. Can you find the pencil and the eyeglasses in this picture? See how quickly you can do it. I'll give you a moment, or you might pause the video until you find them. So if you haven't seen it, I'll give you a hint. The pencil is in the bottom of near the bottom of the image by the mouse. And the eyeglasses are near the center of the image. And now you're probably seeing them sticking out here. So what we've got is, like, I can tell this is eyeglasses, I can tell this is a pencil, even though I'm not able to see the entire object, right? I'm able to perceive what it is from just parts of an object, from pieces. This is really impressive, but this is something computers have a lot of trouble doing. Objects that are partly hidden, our brain can accomplish that for object recognition tasks, but computers can't. Like, there's a challenge to this that the brain is able to do. It's actually pretty impressive. We'll see some other challenges the brain has to overcome. So let's do another one. Can you perceive who these people are? You might just pause this and try and identify the celebrities here. So if you haven't got it yet, we got Will Smith, Tay-Tay, Obama, Clinton, Jackie Chan, Ben Affleck, and Oprah. We don't have that much trouble recognizing things when some of the high frequency information has been taken away. We just have the low frequency information like this. But once again, computers suck at this, suck at recognizing things despite like the blurring to it. So once again, we have to think, how do our brains accomplish that? Like, we have so much information missing, so little to go on. How are we still able to tell that it's these famous people? Like, it's just a freaking blur. But that's pretty impressive. Our brain's doing a lot of work behind the scenes to make that happen. There are other challenges our brain deals with. So, for example, looking at this, I've drawn 5 different shapes here, right? We've got an ellipse. We've got a less circular of an ellipse. We've got a line, or I don't know, a rectangle, right? A really thin rectangle, another ellipse, and then a circle here, right? 5 different shapes. These are not the same shapes, except when they are. Except when they are the same object, and we're just looking at a slightly different angle. Our brain, when looking at something like a quarter from slightly different angles, doesn't see it as shape changing, right? We see it as having an invariant shape, as having an invariant identity. Like, this is still a quarter. I don't assume that it's changing shape as I see it from a different angle. I assume something else about the angling of my vision, right? I correct for that angling. So we have no problem seeing all those different shapes. And actually what we're talking about here is an ability called viewpoint invariance. The ability that we have, so automatic you don't even think about it, but to recognize objects even when their shape, the literal shape that's falling on our retina, the shape of the light hitting our eyes, is very different because we're looking at it from different angles. So it's actually a pretty impressive task. What hits our retina is very different when we change angles, right? So looking at this chair, we get very different shapes from the 3 different angles. Same thing with this door here, right? It's a rectangle here, and then here it's a trapezoid, or whatever the proper geometric term is, but right, angles coming out here. Here more of a trapezoid, right? Less of a rectangle for the door part of it. And yet we recognize that, we interpret it. Our brain automatically sees it as something about spatial, like depth, right? As something coming towards us and seeing it from a different angle, rather than as the door actually changing shape. Both of those two things, the door coming towards us or the door changing shape, both would cause the exact same input onto our retina, right? The same shape would hit our retina, but our brain has to choose between those possibilities and say, what's the most likely interpretation? What should my human here, what should my person and their experience, what should they perceive? What should their experience be? And we don't usually see the world around us as constantly changing shapes just because we're slightly changing our viewpoint. Thankfully, that's a good thing. Now, artists who have learned these ways that the brain, the sort of heuristics and steps that the brain takes behind the scenes, can take advantage of that to create some really cool art. So, for example, you might see some of the street art that people will do where they create these things. It looks like a big, snail getting on the bench here, but seen from a slightly different angle, this is how it's actually painted. You have to be at just the right angle to see this as a giant snail getting up on the bench, right? From any other angle, it's actually just a giant mural at this weird looking thing that's missing part of it. Same thing here. You got what looks like a waterfall in this kind of street or this alley here. But from a different angle, you can see how they actually painted it. They created this illusion that only works if you're looking at it from just the right angle. So artists can take advantage of the way our brain works to create these fun little things. So it looks like we've got water here, but really what they painted was this. So that foot doesn't look like it's so crazy long, but from any other angle where it's not just perfect, then yeah, it's like obvious how the illusion works. Same thing here, you get another example here, right? It looks like that, but only from right where we're standing. Anywhere else you can see the trick. But artists are using the principles by which our brain, or the heuristics by which our brain interprets things when we see them, and automatically perceives certain amounts of depth and automatically perceives it as, yeah, I think this is from this angle based on whatever aspects of the scene it's trying to make sense of. So we're gonna talk some in this video about the rules or heuristics by which our brain tries to make sense of the things we're seeing, and in some ways then can be tricked, right? It can sometimes get it wrong, but it works often enough that these heuristics are good to have, right? Because otherwise there's an infinity of ways to interpret this, and we probably don't want to interpret this when we've got something like this as stretched all the way down the sidewalk, even though that's what it is, because otherwise we would have to interpret this child as also possibly stretched all the way down the sidewalk, or this man is possibly painted all along the road all the way back there and on the opposing curve and painted up on the building behind him. Like, yes, that's possible. That would also cause this to show up on our retina, but it makes much more sense, thankfully, for our brain to jump to the conclusion that probably there's a person here. And for the same reason, it jumps to the conclusion that probably there's a giant cricket here, instead of the less likely conclusion that we've been tricked and actually it's a really long mural all the way down the sidewalk there. So what our brain is dealing with, the problem it has to overcome that's behind all of this stuff, is something called the inverse projection problem. So the proximal stimulus on our retina, meaning the part of the world, right? So there's objects out in the world. Those are the distal stimulus. Light bounces off of those, goes through our front of our eyes, goes through the cornea and the lens, and eventually hits the retina at the back of the eyes, right? That's the proximal stimulus, the pattern of light hitting the retina at the back of our eyes. But that pattern of light is a little bit ambiguous, because we could get that exact same pattern of light hitting our retina, get the same retinal stimulation, but from an infinity of different situations out there in the world. You can kind of get the idea of this by looking at all the ways we could get this kind of rectangular shape hitting our retina. One is we could be looking straight ahead at a rectangular object, a piece of paper. Now, notice if I had a rectangular object made of paper, same thing, but blown up to a larger size and happened to be shown further away, that, just based on these angles, would actually have the exact same light coming in and hitting my retina. Both of them are equal possibilities. They would cause the exact same stimulation to my retina, and thus all of the same input to my brain. My brain has no way to tell the difference. When this hits my eyes and makes my neurons go off in that way, it has no way to tell the difference between the paper being small and close to me or large and far away, or even an infinity of other possibilities, like some very strangely shaped papers at weird angles and weird distances that would also just happen to fall onto our retina in the same way. So the inverse projection problem is the brain has to deal with a sort of two-dimensional projection of that three-dimensional world out there and try and guess from that what is the most likely true state of the world from an infinite number of possibilities. We'll never be able to do this perfectly. Thus, the brain will fall for occasional illusions. We'll sometimes perceive things a little off, right? We'll have misperceptions, but generally the brain's pretty good at this. We're going to see some of the rules it uses to try and solve this problem, to do the best it can, to give its best guess so that we can get through the world and not fall down or misinterpret things all the time. So we can usually get it right. So that's what we're trying to solve, the inverse projection problem. So how does the brain handle this day to day, right? Handle these problems day to day. How does the brain take a stimulus, just a field of lines and colors landing on our retina, and organize it into coherent units, like seeing a distinct object here, a distinct object there, knowing that one object is in front of the other? How does it do that? Now, there were a lot of people thinking about this stuff at the start of psychology, the birth of psychology as a field. In fact, people have thought about some elements of this for a long time in the field of philosophy, but The earliest psychologists to study this would probably be the structuralists. So Wundt, back in around 1880, was already talking about this idea of how we perceive objects and saying, oh, it's kind of a bottom-up process. We perceive objects, like I perceive this as a woman's face, by combining the individual elements, the individual points that my eyes are picking up, right, through my rods and cones, picking those up. It makes sense. This is kind of what we've already seen when we look at the wiring of those different neurons in the visual pathway, the receptive fields and stuff. You could say each dot is just a simple sensation. It's just turning on a rod or a cone. And then our perception of the woman's face is just the combination of those. It's a very bottom-up explanation, saying start from simple features, combine them together, you get the larger whole. That's the idea of structuralists, trying to make sense. If you remember back to your history of psychology type of classes. But that is not necessarily going to help us explain some of the perceptual experiences that we have. So it can't explain everything, because we'll often, for example, perceive things that are not in the stimulation itself, that are not actually sensed by our sensory organs. An example of that would be apparent motion. So here's a little illusion. When people look at this, they will often perceive these dots as going kind of bouncing up and down, opposing, right, on opposing sides, but bouncing up and down. Or you might be perceiving this, some people will see it differently, as dots going left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right. In fact, if you look at this for a while or look at it in your periphery, if you kind of move your eyes, so you're fixating off to the right or the left of it a little ways or above or below it, and stare for a while, you might see it actually switch to left-right movement, where they're going, left and right in opposing bits, or up and down, or it might switch back and forth. But the point is, nothing's changing about this image. All it's doing is switching between two states, two static images. One static image has it in the lower left and the upper right, and then a different static image has it in the bottom right and the upper left. There's no actual movement there, but our brain perceives it as movement. It adds it in based on the timing. If you slow this GIF down a whole bunch, then people don't perceive it as motion. They perceive it as a static image and then a different static image. But if you get the timing right, our brain adds something to that isn't there in the input to our eyes. So that isn't explained for the structuralist. That pure bottom-up account can't explain something like this, something like apparent motion, movement that's perceived when nothing's actually moving. So another example down here, same idea. Some people perceive this as a pair that just moves over, and then the pair's over here and then it moves back. Some people perceive it as the center one staying in place and this one flipping back and forth, the outside one flipping to the left and the right. Whatever way you're perceiving it, though, people report it as it kind of feels like there's some motion going on there, even though that's not the case. There are other versions of this. We do sort of more well-controlled versions in a laboratory, where we might flash a light in one position, then have a certain amount of delay, a certain amount of darkness, and then flash a second light in a different position a certain amount of time later. And depending on the timing we use, depending on how short that delay is, right, just a fraction of a second, when we do that, people actually perceive it as the light moving across the visual space between them. So we have the perception of light kind of in between, even though it's not there. Our brain fills in the blanks. It adds that in. We've seen other ways our brain fills in the blanks. So this is just another example of the kind of stuff we've seen before, where there is some top-down processing. There's some other things going on beyond just what's in the actual stimulus itself. So another example of things that we perceive that aren't actually there in the sensation, there would be things like illusory contours. So we perceive contours like here. And this one on the left, a lot of people perceive a white triangle there. It's hard to not see a white triangle there when someone points to it, even though a totally different way of perceiving this image on this whole white background here would just be three Pac-Man faces, right? Three circles with little open pies out of them. There doesn't have to be a triangle there, but our brain kind of adds the triangle because we see a line here, an edge, right? We have our edge detectors. And then we see another edge or line that's at the same angle. And usually, if we have something at this angle and something further down at that same angle, that comes from a single object going all the way across. So our brain fills in the blank and assumes that there's a sort of line or an edge there, even though there's no actual line, edge, or contour there. That's illusory contours. We perceive something that's not really in the image itself. There's more examples here, including this fun one where it kind of on the right here, for most people, they see it kind of three-dimensionally. It feels like there's a white ball in the center, right? A white sphere in the center with all these spikes on it, even though that doesn't have to be how we interpret this. Really, you can interpret this perfectly two-dimensionally as just a bunch of little black objects or a bunch of little black shapes with no depth at all to that. Our brain adds the depth. We add these things to our perception that aren't there in the stimulus, in the sensation that's going on at our sensory detectors in our eyes, right, in our retina. Here's another example. It's actually won an award at one of the vision conferences I go to. So this is an illusory contour. It's kind of hard to tell what's going on here, but you kind of just barely see as these little dots move up and cross over these other dots and these circles kind of block out parts of these lines here. A lot of people see connecting these dots almost a sort of dark net or a little kind of like, seems like there's a net that's kind of stretching in and out. That's an illusory contour. There's no actual net there. It's our brain adding that. So, okay. That means the structuralists can't be right in terms of their simple idea that perceptions are just the added up pieces of those individual elements. So this led to Gestalt psychology. Gestalt psychologists were really interested in topics of perception, is actually one of the biggest areas they worked in. Starting around the early 1900s, they started documenting these principles of what they called perceptual organization. In other words, they just started saying, what are the rules the brain seems to follow when we're given this ambiguous bunch of crap hitting our eyes? What are the rules the brain seems to use to make its guesses from that infinite possibility space in front of us that organizes that into a perception and says, I'm seeing this as, a cricket nearby rather than stretched all the way down the sidewalk or whatever. So how do we do that? The Gestalt idea was basically our brain adds a lot to the process. There's a lot of top-down stuff going on. So you may have heard the term for Gestalt psychology, like the whole is more than the sum of its parts. They're talking about literal perception with parts and pieces. They're saying like those individual pieces, the actual like rods and cones being activated, those individual elements, that alone doesn't tell the whole story of what we end up perceiving, what we end up experiencing. Something else is being added. Our brain is doing some calculating, some guessing. It's adding something in there that's not in the little parts of stimulation that go into it. That's what they mean by the whole is more than the sum of its parts. We don't just add up sensations into a combined whole perception, but rather our brain is making unconscious inferences behind the scenes, automatically just making these inferences, guesses, and that's what we perceive. We perceive its best guess of what objects are most likely to be out there, to have created that ambiguous stimulation on our retina. So let's talk about some of the principles that the Gestalt psychologists documented. One, we're just going to go through a few of these and see some examples. So one is what they call the principle of good continuation. So lines are usually perceived as following the smoothest path. Of all the possible ways you could interpret a bunch of lines, we usually assume that they'll follow the smoothest path. In other words, they'll continue going straight, or if they're curved, they'll continue with sort of a smooth curve without sudden changes. What I mean by that is, when you look at this pile of rope, our brain just automatically makes sense of this in certain ways as part of the rope continuing along and continuing to come out at another place, following sort of the same smooth curve, the same smooth angle changes. In other words, as we're looking at this piece here and we see it go behind something else and go behind something else, we see this part in orange here as connected to, as being close to or related to this longer part we were just following because it continues the same smooth curve. And likewise, there's a bunch of jumble of crap going on here, but when we get to this chunk of rope up here, we perceive it as continuing this one. Why? Because that's what would happen if it continued at roughly the same smooth angle. Same thing here. So we put that together and realize this is all attached. Right? But we only know that, or we don't know that for sure, right? It could be different. It could be this is a disattached piece of rope and that it's cut off between here and here. That's totally possible and would cause the same stimulation on our retina, but our brain jumps to the most likely conclusion. Based on all of our past experience, our brain is programmed to jump to the conclusion that makes the most sense. Usually when this kind of thing happens, it's because it's a single object that does continue behind there and finish filling that in with the smoothest possible path. Another example of the principle of good continuation here when you look at these points like A versus B versus C versus D, we've got a couple different pairs of headphones here, right? And usually we perceive, when we look at this, there's one way that people perceive this. They perceive A and B as being connected. When you look at this, it seems pretty obvious A is connected to B and C is connected to D, right? But that's not automatically true. It's possible, it's less likely, which is why our brain doesn't jump to that, but it's possible that A would go through here and go around here, and then once it gets here, go up to C and go around here, and actually A could be wired directly to this other set of headphones and not connected at all to B or D. That's possible. We would see the same thing in our eyes if that was the case, but usually things in our environment don't take that sudden turn at a weird angle like that. It's much less likely, much less common. So our brain isn't programmed to jump to that conclusion of the possibilities. Instead, it follows the principle of good continuation. And that's what we just automatically perceive. And it seems so damn obvious to us, but that's because our brain is doing the work behind the scenes. It's following the Gestalt principle of good continuation. Another example of that, looking at this pattern of dots here, right? We've got just a bunch of dots on this white background. There's two ways to perceive it. We could perceive it as a curved line and a straight vertical line, or a slightly curved line and then it takes a sudden turn and goes up to a straight line, and maybe there's this other straight line going up and a sudden curve, right? We could interpret it this way on the right, or this way, or the top right, or this way on the bottom right. But our brain usually jumps. If you ask people what they perceive or show a bunch of examples of this, mostly our brain will jump to this conclusion. It's the simplest one in some way, but that's because it follows the principle of good continuation. It doesn't have a sudden change of angles, which is less likely in the world. Okay, let's talk about some other Gestalt principles. There's the principle of simplicity. So we tend to perceive the simplest organization or structure that would create the stimulus we're looking at. So look at picture A for a moment. There's a couple ways you could interpret this. The most obvious, what people usually jump to, is a sort of Olympic rings thing. Like you see this as 5 circles that are overlapping a little bit. And that is entirely possible. That would cause this stimulation on our retina. But it also could be caused by not a circle, but this sort of, I don't know what you call that, like part of a peach, part of an apple, whatever. And then this little chunk here, this little football shaped chunk here. And then this weird shape, whatever this shape would be called, and this little football shape. Like putting all those together would create the same thing we saw in A. But a bunch of shapes like that creates the same stimulus, but it kind of violates that principle of simplicity compared to the other possibility of 5 circles. And of course, there are other possibilities here too, like this line could just be part of a line and then another part of a line, another part of a line, all separate. But that's not how our brain perceives it, because that would be silly. We would have trouble getting through the world if we jumped to the most complex possible explanation for everything that lands on our retina. Instead, we go with the simplest. That's the principle of simplicity. So another example of that would be looking at a picture like this. What do you think is going on here? So we're just seeing the silhouette, but if you ask people to describe this, most people would say, I see a circle, a triangle, and a rectangle. You might even perceive it as one of them is in front of the other, right? So you can kind of perceive it like this: triangle, circle, and maybe behind it a rectangle. But that doesn't have to be what's going on here, right? It could be that what we've got is this little line here, this line here, and this here, and then this thing going up. And what we've actually got is a sort of keyhole shape, right? That's in front of the piece of paper, or maybe the piece of paper in front of the keyhole shape, or there's a lot of different ways our brain could have interpreted that. But most people jump to the simplest possible explanation for this set of partial lines, this set of partial lines, and we say probably there's some objects in front of one another. So another way of looking at this, or another example of this principle of simplicity, when we look at a stimulus like this, when this lands on our retina, most simple interpretation is one rectangular object in front of, so blocking, another rectangular object, right? So we got this principle that one is kind of taking up some of the visual space because of depth. That's one way to perceive this. And that is the one our brain jumps to. It's the simplest one. But C is also possible. It could be that we've got this kind of L-shaped object that's just been placed up against this rectangular object. That would cause the same thing on our retina, even if they're both at the same distance from us and not one in front of the other, not one blocking the other. But that's not as simple, right? That's a less simple explanation. It's less common relative to our past experience growing up, what usually causes us to see things in front of other things. All right, one last example on the principle of simplicity. Like looking at this picture here on the left, most people perceive this as a rectangle, and then you got like a blue stripe here, a dark blue stripe going vertical, and then a horizontal light blue stripe that's kind of going in front of that dark blue one. So kind of these are the three parts that our brain perceives as making up this whole object here. And yet we could get that exact same perception from this set of objects if they're aligned in the right way, angled in the right way, if this is tilted at the right way, then we could actually have this same perception hitting our retina, the same input to our retina, and we're still going to perceive it, even if it's all these objects put together in this weird, unusual way. We're still going to perceive it as B, right? We're still going to perceive it as a rectangle with a stripe and a stripe because that's the simplest way to perceive that. It's the most likely. So yes, someone can create really cool pieces of artwork that are made up of things like this that confuse our brain into thinking we're seeing something like this. And we go, oh, that's crazy. It's a cool piece of art. But really, that's just our brain following the principle of simplicity. All right, let's talk about a couple others. There's the principle of similarity. We tend to perceive similar things as being grouped together or connected. So for example, looking at these two sets here, right, you can look at this set of all these red dots and there's different ways of perceiving it. Some people might see it as 6 rows of dots or 6 columns of red dots. But now look at B over on the right here. It's very rare when people first describe, you just ask them to describe what they're perceiving here. Very rarely will people say a row of blue, red, blue, red, blue, red, and then another row of blue, red, blue, red. They don't organize it as 6 rows with alternating colors. Our brain jumps most usually to the conclusion of, I'm going to perceive this as a column of blue, a column of red, a column of blue, because it groups them together based on similarity. In this case, similarity of color. There's another example. So in A, we group based on the reds and the greens. In B, we once again group based on the reds and the greens. It's hard not to see this as vertical lines or vertical kind of columns, and it's hard not to see this as horizontal columns or rows, horizontal rows. And likewise here, there are lots of ways to group this. We could see this as a row that's made up of stars, 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 and then a circle, and this one is another row, but the circle in a different place. But usually people perceive this as a sort of diagonal line of circles, and then the field of star and field of stars. Or same thing here, we might group not based on color, but based on size. So these ones in the middle here in D, they tend to get lumped together. We perceive maybe a row here and a row here because they're slightly different outlines, right? Column, 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 column. And then here we've got a row of these big ones. So we base our group based on size just as easily as color, or shape just as easily as color or size. So that was the principle of similarity. Another heuristic our brain seems to follow is the principle of proximity. We tend to perceive things that are near to each other as being grouped together. So just for example, in this top one, most people, when you first glance at this, will perceive it as 5 sets of 2 or 5 pairs of these objects, right? Instead of perceiving it as a set of 3, and then another set of 3, and then another set of 3, and then a singleton left over. That's not what comes to mind when you ask most people. There are a bunch of other ways we could group these together, but our brain jumps to saying, I see it as a pair, a pair, a pair, a pair, and a pair because of proximity. These two are close to each other. These ones are not. Same things here. We tend to group this into 2 columns, 2 columns, and 2 columns, rather than grouping it based on the similarity of color. In other words, in this case, the principles of similarity and proximity kind of conflict with each other. And in this case, we find that proximity might be a stronger cue for people than the similarity of color. So we don't see it as a triplet of black and then a sort of overlapping triplet of red, slightly offset to the right. We tend to see it as one set, and another set based on proximity. Okay, there's another principle. I'll stop. There are others of these you can look up online. You can see more examples, but I just want to give a few of them so you get a feel for these Gestalt principles. But there's one called the principle of common fate. So if things are moving, we tend to perceive things that are moving in the same direction as being grouped together. So we perceive, like here, 2 sets of 3 circles that are kind of moving up as a set, as a group, right? Our brain groups them together into two sets that are moving separately rather than a single set of 6 circles that are kind of blobbing open, or as 6 individual circles that are going up and down and not connected to each other. So let's see an example of this in real life. So what we might perceive, this is what's called a murmuration of starlings. So starlings are a type of bird. They often fly together in these giant groups, and it creates this really cool visuals. But what our brain does is we group it together. You'll actually perceive it as you watch this. You might perceive it. What makes this so cool to watch is it kind of seems like this giant object in the sky that is moving all as a single object or morphing as a single object. And that is your brain following that principle of common fate and lumping together about all those individual starlings. When they're moving together, moving in the same way, it groups them together sort of into a single object. We don't perceive it necessarily as little individual points that just happen to be near each other, right? Our brain, when they're moving together, sees it like this giant object kind of moving. That's the principle of common fate. If you look up starling murmuration, you'll find more examples of videos like this. Okay, and then there's another one, the principle of common region. This would be things that are somehow kind of grouped together in the same region of space. So there's some sort of common border around them. Those are perceived as grouped together. So even though these 2 dots are closer to each other than these 2 dots, it's most common for people to jump to the conclusion that these 2 are kind of in a group together, that we've got an object here, an object here, and an object here, so to speak, rather than seeing it as a singleton, and then these 2 grouped together, even though they're in different regions, and then these 2 grouped together because they're so close, right? And then this singleton alone, that's less likely. Our brain doesn't jump to that as easily. You have to force yourself. You have to really try in order to perceive it that way. There's another one, kind of similar principle of uniform connectedness. So rather than being in the same region of space, you can think of it as they're directly connected, making up the same sort of region together. So things that are directly connected by the same sort of color, texture, and brightness, those get perceived as grouped together. So they're connected in this uniform way. Our brain assumes this is probably all one object, right? That this circle and this circle are connected, even though, again, these 2 circles might be closer together. Our brain doesn't perceive them as grouped together because they don't have that uniform connected area. So this, in this case, it's kind of overriding that principle of proximity. So our brain, sometimes when it's getting conflicting, it has to just guess, but it guesses based on, again, our past experience, making its best guess of the world. That's usually pretty right. So here's an application of that. You see cool photos like this online all the time on Instagram and stuff, but notice how the colored areas of her dress, they get kind of grouped with similar colors in the scene rather than seeing a complete dress or a complete outfit from top to bottom. She gets grouped with the background here, but that's because of the principle of good continuation. So think about how that applies here, right? Like, look at this line, right? This is just an edge. Our V1, our simple cells in the back of our brain in V1 are going to see an edge here, right? An edge, an edge, an edge. A bunch of V1 cells are going off all at once on both sides for this screen. And then we've got also some V1 cells going off at the same angle, the same sort of what would be the continued part of the visual field here. So just because she happened to line up this cool picture on purpose, right? Our brain perceives it as this continued line, and that's what makes this such a neat kind of artwork, right? Same thing here with the white kind of continues on with the white here. The blue kind of matches here, continuation here. And so our brain fills in those blanks and follows those usual rules, and that's what makes us have this weird perception. We kind of feel a little bit tricked when we look at it, in this case, in an enjoyable way, right? Or same thing here. We see their legs, right? The way we perceive this is legs continuing behind these boards, right? That makes sense because the legs kind of continue in a straight line. That's that principle of good continuation, and they're the same color above and below the boards, right? It's a continuous color continuity there, so our brain fills in the blanks, even though it could be something else going on behind this board, or it could be that there isn't a bottom board here, but they painted part of their jeans this color right here, and he painted his jeans this color just right here, and something else is blocking the trees way back in the background. That could also create the same stimulation on our retina, but that's really unlikely. It's much more likely, based on our past experience, that there's some continuous object going straight along here that's blocking another continuous object behind it, and that's why we perceive this as legs behind a board. Principle of good continuation. Now, of course, our experience and our knowledge, they also create a lot of top-down influences on what we perceive. So we've seen some examples of that. Here's another famous example. People make paintings like this sometimes where it's like, find the faces in the painting. So actually in this image, there are a bunch of faces made out of the background things like the trees and the rocks and the river and stuff. So in fact, there are, more than 8, even 13 or more faces in the image here. You might, if you're interested, pause the video and try and find as many of the faces as you can. Okay, and once you see the rocks or the trees as being sort of grouped together into faces, once you've noticed, like there's a face right here with a little mouth, there's a left eye, there's a right eye, there's a nose. Once you see that face, you can't kind of ungroup it. The thing about these heuristics that the brain uses is once you notice it, the brain has kind of programmed that in, and you will recognize it even if you look away from the image and look back. It no longer looks like what it started as. Now you see that face. You see this other face here. You see this other face looking to the left over here. You see this other face made out of these rocks with an eye and an eye. You see another eye over here. You'll start to notice once you've seen them, it sticks. That's the sort of top-down thing. It didn't change anything about the stimulus hitting your retina. Didn't change anything about the bottom-up information, but your brain is adding meaning to it. And once it does, it's going to keep seeing those same things. That influences what we perceive. So really, the brain is just constantly, automatically and unconsciously using all these principles, all of our past experience to make, like I said, inferences, guesses about what objects are out there that created this proximal stimulus on our retina. So these principles, these heuristics, they're not always accurate, right? So we have illusions sometimes or cool artwork that fools us, but they evolve to match environmental regularities, so they're usually right. And of those infinite possibilities, we don't want to be paralyzed by all the infinite possibilities and never act. We have to perceive the world a certain way, and we'd be confused if we constantly perceived it from moment to moment as different possibilities, right? If our brain changed between all the infinite possibilities from every second to every second, we would live in this completely confusing world. That doesn't make sense. So instead, the brain is programmed, sort of evolved to just jump to some conclusion, to jump to its best conclusion and say, that's what I'm going to perceive. Sometimes we get it wrong, but usually it's good enough. We perceive the objects most likely to have caused this stimulation. It's a sort of Bayesian network, right? It's using Bayesian probabilistic reasoning. So for example, when we see something like this blob in this image here, without any other context, any other information, it just looks like a blob, right? But once you've seen it within the context, within all the surrounding cues and other information around it, it's really easy for us to take that blob and say, oh, I know what that is. It looks like a bottle or a glass or some sort of drinking container, something like that, right? But we could take that exact same blob, and if it showed up in a different image, in other words, in a different context, surrounded by other information, we perceive it very differently. The same blob, the same stimulus hitting our retina, might be perceived as a shoe. And that happens automatically, right? If you just show someone picture C, they're going to look at this. You ask them to describe the picture. They'll be like, here's a guy's head. Here's a guy's shirt, kind of a light colored shirt. Looks like bluish jeans. And they will say down here, this thing, they will say, I see a shoe, right? Even though if you'd showed them the blob alone, they would never have said, I see a shoe. And you could show that blob in different areas here. And suddenly we've got, oh yeah, it looks like a car. Or it looks like, I don't know, is that a person waiting at the edge of a curb? Very different things. So a lot of our perception comes from using other information. That is top-down perception, right? Using surrounding contextual cues, top-down knowledge, what we know from the situation or other stuff like that to interpret what is always going to be ambiguous information hitting us from the bottom up, hitting our sensory detectors. So, okay, that is the the power of Gestalt principles. That is how our brain helps perceive objects, or the basics anyway. This is a nice example of that one I talked about before. Turns out all three of these red dots here are equidistant from each other. Like this one in the middle is the same distance from this one on the left as it is from the one on the right. But most people, when you look at it, even if you try, it's hard not to see it as being closer to 1. It just looks like it's closer to 1 than to this one over here, number 3. So anyway, that's our brain following these Gestalt principles. We'll stop there.